Dianne Feinstein, as we speak, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, chairwoman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, is basically dropping a report, shall we say, on the CIA's head. Let's pick up a little bit of Senator Feinstein. Here she is.
The CIA had provided was wrong. The CIA also misled other CIA White House officials. When Vice President Cheney's counsel, David Addington, asked CIA Counsel General Scott Mueller in 2003 about the CIA's videotaping the waterboarding of detainees, Mueller deliberately told him that videotapes, quote, were not being made, end quote, but did not disclose that videotapes of previous waterboarding sessions had been made and still existed. Source, email from Scott Mueller dated June 7, 2003. There are many, many more examples in the committee's report. All are documented. The third set of findings and conclusion notes the various ways in which CIA management of the detention and interrogation program, from its inception to its formal termination in January of 2009, was inadequate and deeply flawed. There is no doubt that the detention and interrogation program was, by any measure, a major CIA undertaking. It raised significant legal and policy issues and involved significant resources and funding. It was not, however, managed.
It was not, however, managed. And this is like Frank Church going off on Richard Nixon. I mean, the only thing that I can remember in my lifetime, or maybe Sam Ervin going off on Richard Nixon or going off on the plumbers. You know, here's what happened in the White House. This is astonishing. Let me just provide a little context. In our first war, the Revolutionary War, we fought against the British. The British were famous for their brutality. They held what they called coffin ships off the coast of the United States, in the ports of Boston and Philadelphia and New York. And they would take American prisoners and basically tie them up or put them in boxes or cages on these ships. And they were dying at the rate of, a dozen a day. These American prisoners tortured on British ships, and they would just throw the bodies overboard. And I mean, it was a freak show, a horror show that every American knew about. How did George Washington respond to this? How did he respond to the fact that a couple of the founders of a couple of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, one of them in particular, I'm forgetting his name right now, his house was burned down, his wife was, taken, his kids were scattered to the four winds. He never again got his family back. I mean, just horrors that the British did. Brutality, violence, torture, murder of prisoners of war. How did George Washington respond to that? Here is Hillary Clinton telling us.
When General Washington led his soldiers across the Delaware River and onto victory in the Battle of Trenton, he captured nearly 1,000 foreign mercenaries, and he faced a crucial choice. How would General Washington treat these prisoners? The British had already committed atrocities against Americans, including torture. As David Hackett Fisher describes in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Washington's Crossing, thousands of American prisoners of war were treated with extreme cruelty by British captors. There are accounts of injured soldiers who surrendered being murdered instead of quartered. Countless Americans dying in prison hulks in New York Harbor. Starvation and other acts of inhumanity perpetrated against Americans confined to churches in New York City. Well, you can imagine the light of our ideals shone dimly in those early dark days, years from an end to the conflict, years before our improbable triumph and the birth of our democracy. General Washington announced a decision unique in human history, sending the following order for handling prisoners. Treat them with humanity and let them have no reason to complain of our copying the brutal example of the British Army in their treatment of our unfortunate brethren. George Washington understood that how you treat enemy combatants can reverberate around the world. We must convict and punish the guilty in a way that reinforces their guilt before the world and does not undermine our values.
There you go. And would you forward that clip to Nate and Andrew, please? This is brilliant. Right? That was George Washington, our first president, the commander-in-chief of the military during the Revolutionary War, saying, not only don't torture the British prisoners of war, treat them nicely. And as a consequence of that, after the war was over, two things happened. Actually, one, British soldiers began surrendering in droves because life was tough being a soldier in the Revolutionary War, particularly during the winters. And they knew that if they surrendered, they'd be treated decently. So, every British soldier who surrendered or every mercenary who surrendered was another soldier that we didn't have to fight. So that was the first thing that happened, and it helped us win the war. The second thing that happened was that after the war, an awful lot of the people who became new American citizens were former British soldiers or former Hessian or Prussian mercenaries, German mercenaries, who had come over here to fight on behalf of the British for a British paycheck, had been and saw, hey, these Americans, they're essentially human. And they stayed here. Number one, that's our first war. Our second big war was the Civil War. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Hague Conventions, right? But did you know that the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, the conventions that deal with how to treat prisoners of war and basically not torturing people, the Hague Conventions that under which, like Slobodan Milosevic was tried and Radovan Karadzic, the butcher of Sarajevo, the psychiatrist who organized the rape camps there and things like that. Those conventions were written by Abraham Lincoln and submitted to the United States Congress for ratification on April 24th, 1863, at the end of the Civil War. It was called the Lieber Treaty, or the Lieber Code, excuse me. It set out comprehensive regulations for, basically all of these things. Abraham Lincoln. One of the reasons so many Germans surrendered to us during World War II, particularly in the last 6 months of the war, the Japanese, didn't know about this, right? Japanese media was very, very tightly controlled. But the Germans had figured out, if you surrendered to the Americans, you'd get 3 squares and a cot. And again, German soldiers were surrendering to us at the end of World War II, enthusiastically. And now comes this god-awful crime committed in our name by our government. There's an op-ed in today's New York Times by Mark Mazzetti of the American Civil... that's the article. There's an op-ed by Anthony Romero, who's the head of the ACLU, titled Pardon Bush and Those Who Tortured. This is so solid. President Obama, here is your opportunity to say to the world, these people committed a crime. We don't sanction it. We are not that. We are better than that. Issue a pardon for George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and the whole bunch of them. John Yoo, Jay Bybee, Wolfowitz, Feith, the whole bunch. Issue a pardon for the crimes that were committed here.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And when you do so, invoke the memory of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And for that matter, Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower.